It's widely accepted that Konosuba is a good show. Fun comedic pacing, a trapped in another world story that actively parodies fan favourite games such as Monster Hunter and Dragon Quest, and characters that are as lovable as they are shitty people. But what is often overlooked is the impact of animation on creating these impressions. Despite how reviews are structured, narrative and animation are intertwined factors, and many of the choices within animation weren't made just to be applauded independently, but rather to get people saying, Konosuba is a good show. Loose animation often goes fairly unappreciated despite its merits within the art of movement. Famously, according to Disney's Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas's 12 Principles of Animation, good movement takes notes of ideas of squash and stretch. This is all part of developing a visual personality. Konosuba is funny, but a huge part of that is in its animation, and whilst the novels are good, the anime takes advantage of its medium, and it's this brilliant use of loose, fun animation that really delivers on that. Animation isn't about taking screenshots, posting them to social media, and claiming them as examples of bad animation. It's about the movement. One of the figures who really embraced this was Shinya Takahashi, an animator with 30 years experience of creating expressive action and character acting scenes. As someone who works a lot with Studio Dean, he is one of the best animators attached to the studio. With Konosuba being his second time working under director Kanezaki, their first team up on Is This a Zombie was filled with exciting moments, and the same goes for Konosuba. Opening up the series with this scene of Aqua and Kazuma working, the whole thing is hugely more complex than it looks, and was derived from just a few lines of prose within the novel. Too many people, myself included, make the mistake of constantly covering action and effects animation and passing over on opportunities to talk about character animation and the way personality is shown through motion. This cut of Kazuma collapsing as his face contorts and stretches out of proportion is brilliant in its delivery of purpose. Yeah, the joke is simple. Kazuma's doing the hard work, Aqua's doing the easy work, but it's Takahashi's animation that makes it funny, and you can see those ideas of squash and stretch coming into play throughout. Takahashi's impact on Konosuba is very noticeable, and he's brought on to create some of the series' most significant action scenes in future episodes. Most recently, he key animated this cut from episode 6 of the second season, using a large amount of drawings to really deliver the idea that this is a serious moment, making sure to include all of Kazuma's reactions and focus, not through silly expressions, but through smaller movements. And by comparing the approaches Takahashi took to these two cuts, we can once again get an idea of how animation supports narrative in Konosuba. And that's not to deny the thing that many have appreciated about Konosuba from early on: the explosions. There's no official title for Chief Explosions Animator, but if there was, it'd be a position held by Kazunori Ozawa. Explosions are exciting work, and Ozawa agrees. Seriously, even on his Twitter, he'll occasionally link movie explosion reels or just explosions in real life. He's someone who's heavily influenced by the work he appreciates, and each explosion within Konosuba seems to reflect that. For example, if you compare this cut from Gurren Lagann by Yo Yoshinari, you can see that Ozawa attempts to reflect this style to change things up and keep the explosions interesting. But there's an elephant in the room when it comes to the animation design, and in a way that's probably how the title of character designer should be recognised, since it's also a role of supervision. And whilst the title of Chief Animation Director isn't entirely clear, most interpret it as being the responsibility to uphold a level of consistency throughout a series. This means corrections, redraws, scrapping. The chief AD is someone whose job it is to understand the animation character designs and work with the staff to put everyone on the same page regarding their limits. But what if you gave that job to a talented animator who doesn't agree with those fundamentals? What if the chief AD was someone who wanted to see raw animation talent regardless of the inconsistencies and odd expressions? This isn't a hypothetical, this is Koichi Kikuta. When it becomes group work, you end up not being able to tell who drew what. I'm not really a fan of that. As far as I'm concerned, the role of animation director, or a chief animation director, is antithetical to the art of drawing illustrations. That's why I have no desire to correct the faces or anything like that, even when I'm acting as chief animation director. That's a quote by Kikuta himself. He goes on to say that when it comes to character faces, those sorts of things should be left to the animator in question. He has no desire to correct this work, because when he submits work himself, he wants to show what he created, and he understands that many animators feel the same way. It can almost seem like an adversarial situation, like it's a case of choosing the animators over the viewers, but it's really not that simple, and as many have noted before me, the loose movement can be a part of the show's comedic appeal. And it's not like Kikuta's talking out of his arse anyway, here's just a small sampling of his own animation. Koichi Kikuta is a hard man to hate. He's not just someone who understands animation, but he's also someone who finds it difficult to stop loving that raw personal nature to it, that ability to see yourself on screen. It's an approach that he even took when he directed... Okay, I wasn't going to mention this, but Anal Vampire Episode 2. He used a pseudonym, but there's a similar approach to animation. You can watch it in your own time. However, Anal Vampire aside, Kikuta's role on the show isn't limited to his job title. As someone who was the chief animation director for every odd-numbered episode, he dedicated a lot of time towards creating layouts, especially for episode 9. Layouts are pretty much what they sound like, scaffolds for a scene, ideas for how the final episode should look. For example, here's a great one from Megumi Kono's scene in Your Lie in April, complete with notes and details. Now, here's the distinction with Kikuta. He didn't want to correct faces after the animation had been done, but he did want to find the time to correct layouts and make those consistent. And as I mentioned earlier, episode 9 was certainly the epicenter for how much work he put into the show. Trying to make the composition as realistic as possible is par the course for me, and I always draw layouts with the hopes of bringing out a camera-like or photo-like feel. I did my very best to evoke that with episode 9, but when I looked it up on the internet, people only talked about the boobs. Not a single person talked about the layouts. It was devastating. Now, Kikuta was joking with that last comment, but it is something that's interesting to illustrate in that we don't put much focus on animation design. Episode 9 was a brilliant episode to appreciate, but perhaps not one that was comfortable to watch. It's probably no surprise that Kikuta is a fan of characters with large breasts, but he's got his own ideas about how they move, that whilst leads into impressive animation, it's not something that's easy to appreciate in the same way as his other work. And thankfully, in Season 2 airing at the moment, Kikuta had more people to help him manage the load, most notably Yasuyuki Ebara, the action animation director behind Attack on Titan and chief animation director for the opening episodes to Carbonari, and whilst he doesn't have that sort of comedic looseness, he has an invaluable place working on the show's action scenes, taking Kikuta's ideas and applying his own experience into the second season's 2nd and 6th episodes. With all that said though, Konosuba is far from perfect, and whilst the show does feature incredible animation as highlighted in this video, and Kikuta is a remarkable person, totally deserving of respect, the consistent application of his ideas don't always pan out and can prove divisive. I said earlier that animation is part of the narrative, but even when the animation and layouts are really great, like in episode 9, the challenging reality that it creates can drive people away. Even though Kikuta has stated that he wants to go into illustration, I do hope that he returns to animation supervision. Konosuba was early days, but with the application of his perspective on individual freedom and guidance, he could be a genuinely fascinating force in the industry. And before I go, Here's Kikuta talking about boobs. I more or less tried to keep the same level of realism when it came to things like weight or a sense of space. In most episodes, the boobs don't jiggle that much, so it might look as if they jiggle quite a lot in episode 9. But it's not that strange for boobs to jiggle a lot as a biological phenomenon. Once I started thinking that way, it occurred to me that it would be unnatural if they didn't move. Oh, you've gotta love the guy. Thanks for watching the Canipa Effect, and I hope this video gave you a better appreciation for what goes into Konosuba. The interview with Koichi Kikuta, funded by Wave Motion Canon and the Canipa Effect Patreon, is in the description. But before we wrap up, I'd like to thank these brilliant people for supporting the channel. In particular, I'd like to give a special thank you to the articulate Albareo, the mighty Mancotula plant, the celebrated Constantine Matviv, the super Sam Lydiard, the memorable Martin Grajiner, the astonishing Abel Toy, the powerful Petra Clothier, and the confident Chris Haas.